Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It has long been my conviction, born of experience and observation, that the human soul is a vessel both noble and perilously flawed. In my time at the side of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I bore witness to acts of such calculating malice, often hidden beneath a veneer of respectability, that even the most cynical philosopher might recoil. Chief among the instigators of such deeds I have found is the lure of rare and beautiful things, treasures that awaken envy, greed and desperation in equal measure. There is something uniquely insidious about the theft of a jewel. Unlike money, which comes and goes with fortune's wheel, or art, which may evoke lofty sentiment, a gem seems to reach into the very core of possession. It is silent, cold and radiant, unchanging in its beauty, and for some, irresistible in its promise of power or status. It was during one such grey season, when the lamps of London flickered early and the fog slithered through the streets like some living thing, that a case came to us which revolved not only around the theft of a magnificent jewel, but around deeper, darker questions of legacy, guilt, and imperial pride. The affair of the Star of Calighat, as it came to be known in certain discreet circles, remains in my memory not for its scale or notoriety, but for the quiet tragedy at its heart and the singular brilliance with which Holmes unravelled it. Let me now set down the facts as I remember them, beginning, as all things in our shared life so often did, at 221 B. Baker Street, on a night when the world outside seemed intent on silence. The November fog had grown particularly thick that evening. It rolled past our sitting-room window in pale waves, each drift seeming to carry with it a fragment of the city's sorrow. Within our rooms, however, there was warmth, the gentle crackling of the fire, the faint aroma of tobacco from Holmes's pipe, and the quiet strains of his violin, which he played with that peculiar intensity that often overtook him when no case occupied his formidable mind. I had taken refuge in a medical journal, though I admit my concentration faltered, lulled by the combination of music and the hypnotic movement of the fog. Holmes stood by the window, the instrument beneath his chin, his eyes closed in thought. The melody he played was sombre and wandering, an Eastern motif perhaps, with undertones that hinted at both longing and unease. "You are restless," I remarked at length, breaking the spell. "Not restless, Watson. Merely waiting," he replied without opening his eyes. "For what?" "For the world to deliver something worthy of interest. The last 3 days have offered nothing but petty quarrels and misguided suspicions." I was about to respond when we were interrupted by the sharp sound of a knock upon the door below. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed, low and startled, and then footsteps ascending in haste. Holmes lowered his violin and turned to me with a gleam of anticipation. "Well," he said, "perhaps the fog brings more than chill tonight." The door opened to reveal a tall woman, elegantly attired but visibly distressed. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes wide with agitation, and though she carried herself with the bearing of nobility, her gloved hands trembled as she stepped into the warmth of our chambers. "Miss Amelia Carstairs," announced Mrs. Hudson softly, before retreating. Holmes gestured toward the armchair nearest the fire. "Pray, be seated," he said with quiet authority. You are troubled. I am, she replied, settling herself without ceremony. Forgive the hour. I was told you keep irregular ones. You were told correctly, Holmes answered. Now then, begin at your convenience. The lady drew a deep breath. A theft, Mr. Holmes, a theft most vile and baffling. Indeed. Of what nature? A jewel, the star of Calicut, a sapphire of extraordinary size and value, bequeathed to me by my late father, Colonel Edward Carstairs, formerly of the Bengal Lancers. Holmes leaned forward, the name clearly piquing his interest. It was kept under lock and key in a secured display case in my personal study. This morning it was gone. No sign of forced entry. The windows and doors remain untouched. I questioned every member of the household. No one saw or heard anything. A locked room theft, then, Holmes murmured. And the timing. 3 days hence, I am to present it at the annual Calcutta Relief Gala. If word of the theft spreads, it would ruin me socially and financially. The insurers would seize upon the faintest suspicion of fraud. Her voice faltered. I had nowhere else to turn. Holmes tapped his fingers together and smiled faintly. Then, madam, you have come precisely to the right place. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes half-lidded, as though listening to some internal melody of logic. You say there were no signs of tampering? None. The case is made of thick glass, mounted upon a mahogany plinth, and secured by a French lock, quite intricate. Only I and Mr. Hargreaves, my butler, possess keys. The windows were latched from within, the door bolted during the night, yet the gem is gone. Holmes steepled his fingers. Was the lock damaged? Not in the slightest. Hargreaves examined it at my request. He has military training and swore it showed no signs of forced entry. And the staff? They were as shocked as I. I keep only 3 servants now, Hargreaves, Eliza my maid, and a footman who had the night off. Interesting, Holmes murmured. Was anything else taken? Nothing. The surrounding items, silver inlaid boxes, ivory ornaments and framed miniatures, remained untouched. Holmes turned toward me, the trace of a smile beneath his eyes. Watson, I dare say we are not looking at an ordinary thief. And the police? I asked. Lady Amelia looked away, her voice lowered. I have not informed them, not yet. Ah, Holmes said more to himself than to us. A locked case, no forced entry, no alarm raised. A puzzle posed with precision. He stood, hands clasped behind his back. There is elegance in such theft, he mused. Too elegant to be impulsive. No, this was deliberate, calculated, possibly rehearsed. His voice lowered. Which makes it all the more enjoyable. Lady Amelia's composure began to falter, and for the first time, I detected the undercurrent of fear beneath her finely measured speech. I fear, she said, that the implications extend far beyond the theft itself. She paused. The Star of Calicut was to be unveiled in 3 days' time at the Calcutta Relief Gala. Its absence would not only rouse suspicion, it would cast a shadow over my family name. Some might whisper of fraud. The insurance company, already hesitant, would seize upon the opportunity to deny the claim. She drew in a breath, her voice trembling. My father acquired the gem in India. There are complexities surrounding its provenance. If they are stirred again, old wounds may reopen. Holmes inclined his head. Then, madam, we must resolve this quietly and swiftly, before reputations unravel and history is rewritten. He turned to me with that glint I knew too well. It is a matter, Watson, that bears our attention. Holmes turned toward the hearth, his gaze momentarily fixed upon the dancing flames. A locked room mystery, he said softly. is a rare delight, but one with imperial echoes and social peril. Ah, that is something richer still. Lady Amelia rose, visibly steadier now, and Holmes promised discretion with a curt nod. "You shall hear from me by tomorrow," he said. "I must first walk through the fog. There are always whispers in the fog." As the door closed behind her, Holmes reached for his violin once more. "I trust you've nothing pressing, Watson," he said, the bow poised. "For I believe we are engaged." It was shortly past 9 o'clock the following morning when Holmes and I found ourselves seated in a hansom cab, rattling eastward toward Belgravia. The fog of the previous night had not lifted, but rather settled into a dense, clinging pall that rendered the outlines of buildings ghost-like and uncertain. Holmes, for his part, seemed invigorated by the obscurity, his grey eyes alight beneath the brim of his travelling hat. "There is an elegance to locked-room thefts, Watson," he remarked, tapping his long fingers together. "They appeal to the theatrical instincts of the criminal mind. It is no small feat to remove an object from a sealed space and leave behind not the faintest whisper of one's presence. And yet, you believe this to be more than a trick of locks and timing?" "Unquestionably. Lady Amelia's urgency is genuine, but the atmosphere of her account suggests something deeper. She withheld certain details, I am sure of it, not out of deceit, but delicacy." "You believe her father's military past to be involved?" "Perhaps. The gem's history in India, the timing of its planned unveiling, and the reluctance to summon the police all point to a web larger than a mere theft." "And what of the suspects?" He smiled faintly. "If the house is as quiet as she claims, then the guilty party has walked those halls in silence and shadow. We shall see what the walls of Carstairs House are willing to confess." With that, we turned into Eaton Place. The Carstairs residence proved to be an elegant, though somewhat sombre, townhouse, nestled discreetly between taller, newer buildings. Upon our arrival, we were met by the butler, Mr. Hargreaves, a tall, rigid man with iron-grey hair, a bristled moustache, and the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier. His manner was crisp to the point of severity, though not discourteous. "I have made the study available for your inspection, sir," he announced, leading us through the polished corridors. "Lady Amelia awaits." As we passed, Holmes cast his gaze over the decor, his eyes pausing briefly on a portrait of Colonel Carstairs, painted in full regimental uniform, sabre in hand. In the drawing-room stood Lady Amelia, now more composed but visibly watchful. Beside her stood a young woman with a pale, pinched face. Miss Eliza Trent, the maid, and a man some years younger than Amelia herself, though marked by a certain weariness about the eyes. "This is my cousin, Rupert Carstairs," Lady Amelia said. "He returned from Ceylon 2 weeks ago. I felt it best to keep him informed of the matter." Rupert bowed stiffly, his expression unreadable. "Curious business," he muttered. "I'd wager your Mr. Holmes will find nothing. That case hasn't been touched." "Perhaps," Holmes replied blandly. "But we shall let the room speak for itself." Eliza, who had been silently wringing her hands, now curtsied and withdrew. "There is loyalty here," Holmes whispered to me once the maid had departed, "but also fear. A curious combination." Lady Amelia led us onward. The Sapphire room awaited. The room wherein the jewel had been kept was a study of restrained luxury. Its furnishings were dark and heavy, the air scented faintly with beeswax and dust. Upon a central pedestal, beneath a domed glass case, there remained nothing but an empty velvet cushion, deep blue in colour, and faintly indented where the gem had once lain. Holmes stood before it without speaking, then crouched, his eyes level with the lock. He produced a small lens from his breast pocket and examined the latch with meticulous care. No scratches, no warping of the mechanism. Either this was opened with a key, or by someone with hands far more delicate than most locksmiths possess. He leaned in further, then withdrew a pair of tweezers from his coat. With great care, he lifted a fine black fibre from the interior of the case. "Velvet," he murmured, "but not the same weave as the cushion. A garment, perhaps." Lady Amelia had remained at the threshold. "The case is cleaned regularly, of course." "And the cleaning cloths?" Holmes asked. "Stored elsewhere." Holmes nodded, then turned his attention to the windows. They were tall, shuttered, and securely latched. He tested them one by one, but they held firm. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, pausing once to sniff the air. "Do you detect it, Watson?" he asked. I inhaled cautiously. "Something sweet, spicy even." "Precisely. Cinnamon, or something like it. Faint, but distinct." Finally, he moved to the fireplace and stooped once more. "A room reveals its secrets, Doctor," he said, "but only to those who ask properly." And with that, we stepped into the garden-facing hallway beyond. Holmes returned to the display case, which seemed at once innocent and accusatory in its emptiness. He motioned me nearer as he pointed to the glass just above the latch. "You see, Watson, observe the smudges here. Faint, but present." I bent down and saw them. Barely perceptible streaks, as though left by gloved fingers or the careful pads of one accustomed to concealment. "And here," Holmes continued, delicately using his tweezers to lift another minute strand from the crevice beside the hinge. "We have another thread, black velvet, but with a finer weave than that used on the interior cushion." "You suspect a garment?" "Not merely suspect. I am nearly certain. The positioning suggests it caught on the lock as it was being manipulated, though not forced. The absence of scratches tells us the lock was opened with care. Either a key was used or—" He paused, inhaling again deeply. "Our thief was a connoisseur." I caught the scent more strongly now, a sweet, almost musky aroma that called to mind exotic markets and warmer climates. "You noted the smell earlier?" I asked. "I did. It is not native to this room. Cinnamon, certainly, but mixed with another element, perhaps cardamom or clove. I shall make inquiries. Such aromas do not drift uninvited into Belgravian parlours." He stepped back, contemplative. "The theft was not the act of a brute, Watson. It bears the mark of one who planned with precision, and who, I dare say, wishes to return what was taken." "Return it?" Holmes said nothing further, but the corner of his mouth lifted faintly. We proceeded to the garden that lay just beyond the French windows of the study. Tall panes now tightly latched. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a neat stretch of lawn bordered by winter-barren shrubs. Holmes gestured for me to lead. I stepped cautiously onto the stone path and surveyed the earth. It was soft with moisture and left impressions easily. Near the flower beds, I paused. "Holmes," I called, "there's something here." He joined me silently. The impressions I had found were indeed footprints. 2 sets, perhaps, though faded. One appeared smaller, the other deeper, more urgent in its placement. "They're faint," I said, crouching, "but fresh enough, at least within the past day." Holmes nodded. This would be the most natural approach from the rear of the property, screened by hedges, out of view from the lane. He knelt beside the marks, studying them intently. "Note the angle. The deeper set. He was moving quickly, either in flight or haste. The shallower ones are more deliberate. Possibly a woman's." "You think it was Eliza?" I think it is unwise to name shadows before they step into the light, Holmes replied. He rose and brushed his hands clean. Yet the fact remains, someone entered or exited through this space, and it was not by chance. He turned toward the house. The puzzle grows richer, my dear Watson. It is no longer merely a question of how the sapphire vanished, but of why it must be returned without being seen. There was a pause before he added, and someone, somewhere, is already regretting their part in it. Holmes had not been idle during our time at the Carstairs estate. While I remained within to question the staff, more for form than revelation, he made discreet inquiries among the neighbouring tenants. When he returned, it was with a subtle shift in his bearing I had come to recognise. The look of a man whose suspicions had found fertile soil. "There is an elderly music teacher who lodges 2 doors down," he said, removing his gloves as we walked. "A Miss Langford. She lives alone and suffers from a malady of sleeplessness. As such, she's become, unwittingly, a chronicler of the nocturnal world." And what did Miss Langford witness? Not quite witness, but hear. At approximately 2 o'clock on the night in question, she was roused by a sound she described as a wandering melody, played, she insists, upon a flute or similar wind instrument. "A flute?" I asked in astonishment. "Yes. Played softly, yet with distinct phrasing. She opened her window and believes the sound emanated from the garden behind the Carstairs house. She could see nothing, of course, the fog was too thick. But the music persisted for nearly 3 minutes, then ceased as suddenly as it began." Holmes paused. "She says it was not a tune she recognised, but it struck her as foreign. Eastern, perhaps." I considered this. A signal. Precisely. A thief with such precision does not act without coordination. The music may have marked a moment, perhaps the distraction, perhaps the all clear, but it was deliberate. And the staff? No one heard it? None admitted to it. But Miss Langford has no reason to fabricate. The ears of the sleepless often hear what others choose to ignore. Holmes turned toward the mist-laced rooftops above. "The ghost of that melody still lingers in the air, Watson. We must find the musician." Though Holmes's method is often shrouded in silence, I have come to recognise the subtle signs when his web of deductions begins to tighten. It was after our return from Belgravia that he dispatched several telegrams in quick succession, each to an obscure correspondent whose name, I suspect, appeared only in Holmes's private index. I asked no questions, knowing that an answer, when it arrived, would come in its own time. That time arrived 2 mornings later, in the form of a crisply folded envelope bearing the mark of the Colonial Office. Holmes read its contents, folded the sheet with a faint smile, and handed it to me. "Rupert Carstairs," it read, "departed Colombo under pressure from creditors, having accrued substantial debts through gambling in local dens, many of which were reportedly run by disreputable Eurasian syndicates. His ship passage to England was arranged hastily, and his accounts remain unsettled." I looked up. "That certainly casts a shadow over the gentleman's return." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "What intrigues me is the timing. He arrived barely a fortnight before the sapphire was due to be unveiled, and yet claims no interest in the gem. But surely with his debt, he would leap at the chance to steal and sell it." "Just so. And yet his manner is not one of desperation." I detected a cool detachment in his voice, as though he expected to be suspected and welcomed it. "You believe he wishes to distract us?" "Possibly. Or perhaps he carries a greater burden, one not yet visible. In any case, we must watch him carefully." Holmes paused before the fire. "Sometimes, Watson, The guilty do not flee from suspicion. They walk toward it, confident they are shielded by a deeper lie. It fell to me that afternoon to make a quiet inquiry at a modest pawnbroker's establishment not far from Paddington. Holmes, as was his wont, had been informed by an anonymous but reliable contact that a young woman answering Eliza Trent's description had recently sold a sapphire pendant of remarkable likeness to the missing star of Calichat. The establishment itself was dim and narrow, with rows of trinkets glinting behind aged glass. The proprietor, a man of slow speech and nervous disposition, confirmed the transaction without hesitation. "Yes, sir. Came in 3 days past. A maid, by her dress. Said it was from her grandmother. I paid her £12. A fine stone, but not flawless." I requested to examine the item. He produced it with care. A pendant set in worn gold, its centrepiece a blue gem of impressive hue, though far smaller than Lady Amelia's sapphire. I turned it in my hand. "You are certain she said it was an heirloom?" "Swore to it, sir." Looked frightened, truth be told. With Holmes's permission, I acquired the piece and returned to Baker Street. There, Holmes examined it beneath his glass. "Not the same gem," he said, "but too similar in colour to be ignored. A clever diversion, perhaps, or the remnant of a greater plan." "Do you believe she is involved?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that guilt leaves traces not in action alone, but in silence, and Miss Trent has been most careful to say nothing at all." Later that evening, Holmes and I returned once more to Belgravia. The air had grown colder, the sky above thick with winter's gloom. Holmes, however, was animated, his pace brisk and eyes alert. "I have arranged for Lady Amelia to distract the household," he said as we entered through the back garden. "Meanwhile, we shall pay a visit to the greenhouse." "The greenhouse?" I have reason to believe it hosted a conversation not meant for public ears. We moved swiftly along the gravel path. Behind the ivy-clad frame of the glass house, Holmes paused and held up a hand. We listened. A murmur, low, agitated, carried faintly from within. We drew closer. "I told you it would come back to haunt us," said a voice, firm, tinged with fear. "I did my part. You keep quiet, and we'll both walk free," came the reply. A rustle, then silence. Holmes motioned for us to withdraw. We slipped away unseen and circled back to the front door, where Hargreaves greeted us, his face unreadable. "You were out," Holmes said mildly. "A walk before supper, sir. The air is bracing." Holmes smiled. "Indeed it is." As we departed, I cast a glance over my shoulder. Hargreaves stood motionless, framed by the gaslight. An upright figure, yet now ringed with unease. Holmes said nothing, but I knew from the quickening in his step that our case had taken a darker turn. The following morning found Holmes once again in Lady Amelia's study, crouched before the now infamous display case with a jeweller's lens fixed to his eye. I stood nearby, notebook in hand. Though Holmes had made it plain, he required no conversation. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, pointing to the latch of the glass casing. "This edge, barely perceptible, is worn in a manner inconsistent with routine use. It suggests the application of pressure from an angled tool, not a key." I leaned closer. "So the lock was picked?" "Not conventionally. It was persuaded rather than forced, by one with precision and delicacy. I suspect a filigree blade or an antiquated spring pick. But that is not all." He extracted another dark thread from the hinge, finer than the first, but unmistakably similar. "Again, velvet. That makes 2 strands from 2 separate visits or one particularly careless moment. And here, do you see it? He gestured toward the brass mount encasing the glass dome. I narrowed my eyes. A mark, small, irregular. An abrasion, recent. It aligns perfectly with the pressure mark on the other side. Whoever opened this case lacked either time or calm enough hands. Holmes stood. The absence of fingerprints, Watson, is not an omission. It is a signature. Gloves were worn, chosen with forethought. Everything about this act speaks of control. And yet it was imperfect. Indeed, which tells us that despite all its elegance, the theft was either hurried or troubled by conscience. He crossed to the window and looked out into the grey. There is guilt in this house, Watson, and it grows restless. Like smoke, it clings to the curtains, though none admit to lighting the flame. The incident occurred later that same day, while Holmes and I were seated with Lady Amelia in her drawing room, discussing the timeline of her cousin Rupert's return. Her words had just begun to stray toward uncertain recollections, when the door flew open and Miss Eliza Trent, breathless and pale, burst inside. "My lady," she gasped, "your silver snuff-box. It's gone." Lady Amelia stiffened. "Gone? From where?" "From your writing desk. I fetched the ledger as you instructed, and when I returned, it was no longer there." Holmes rose instantly. "Who else had access to the room?" Eliza faltered. "Only myself. But the door was ajar. Anyone might have—" Holmes was already striding down the hall, and we followed close behind. The writing room was empty, but undisturbed, save for the absence of the ornate silver snuff-box that had rested beside a stack of monogrammed papers the day before. Lady Amelia's distress deepened. "It was a gift from my father," she whispered. "He carried it in India. Why steal it now?" Holmes knelt before the writing table, examining the blotter and surrounding surface. "Not for its silver," he said thoughtfully, "nor for sentiment. No, it was a test." "A test?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "The first theft was precise and hidden. This one was open, abrupt, and designed to provoke." "Provoke what?" "Panic or exposure. Someone fears we are drawing too near and wishes to divert us or force a misstep." He turned toward Lady Amelia. "We must proceed quietly now. Let no word of this theft leave the household. The thief is still among us, and they are watching." The next morning, I found Holmes deep in correspondence, his desk strewn with open envelopes and telegraph slips. He looked up with a familiar glint in his eye. "Watson, we shall take a brief journey this afternoon. To Lambeth." "To Lambeth?" I asked, puzzled. "Indeed, I've arranged to meet a spice merchant." "Spice merchant?" Holmes folded his hands. "Do you recall the scent we encountered in the study? Cinnamon and something more elusive?" "Yes. Perhaps clove?" "Cardamom, I believe. A compound used in certain incense blends and, more curiously, as a preservative in silk packaging for jewels, specifically those exported through Calcutta." My interest was piqued. "And what connection does this merchant hold?" "His firm imported goods from the East for several decades and maintained clients in both India and London's West End. One such client, according to the records I obtained, made a recent and unusual purchase: 2 pouches of incense-scented velvet, normally used for ceremonial wrapping." "And who was this client?" Holmes smiled faintly. The name given was Hargreaves, but no forename. I sat back. "You believe Lady Amelia's butler purchased the velvet used in the theft?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that Mr. Hargreaves is more than he appears. And now, Watson, let us see what the good merchant has to tell us. For the scent of guilt, like spice, lingers long after it is spilled." It was later that evening when Holmes, with deliberate casualness, requested that I pay a visit to a particular tavern near the Strand, one rumoured to be favoured by returning colonial officers and seamen. And if you should see our friend Rupert, he added, do not confront him. Merely observe. I found the establishment as instructed. A low-lit, smoky place filled with murmurs and clinking glasses. After a short interval, Rupert Carstairs did indeed arrive. He spoke briefly with a man in a grey coat and passed him a folded slip of paper before slipping out through the back entrance. I waited only a moment before following. The alley was narrow and dimly lit by a flickering gas lamp. Rupert moved quickly, coat collar raised, but not with the air of one evading detection, rather as one already convinced he had lost all. I kept my distance, turning corners silently until the stillness was broken by sudden movement. An arm from the shadows lashed toward me, striking my shoulder and sending me reeling against the wall. I recovered swiftly, revolver half drawn, but the assailant had vanished. Rupert was gone. I returned to Baker Street, shoulder sore and ego bruised. Holmes listened attentively. He was not surprised to be followed, I concluded, but someone else didn't care for it. Indeed, Holmes murmured. The blow was meant as a warning, not to silence, but to distract. Rupert is playing a game, but he is not its master. He leaned back, eyes half closed. And now we must move quickly, Watson, for I fear our adversary grows desperate, and desperate minds are prone to rashness. It was on a Thursday morning that Holmes, with a quiet finality that brooked no discussion, informed Lady Amelia that he intended to draw the curtain on our mysterious affair. We had returned once more to the Carstairs estate, this time not in pursuit of evidence, but to prepare a performance of sorts, a staging as deliberate and cunning as any devised by our adversary. He gathered the household in the drawing-room under the pretext of sharing the latest developments. I observed each face closely. Lady Amelia composed, but strained. Rupert Carstairs oddly impassive. Eliza Trent pale, her eyes darting. And Mr. Hargreaves, upright as ever, betraying not a flicker of surprise. My inquiries, Holmes began, have yielded a promising lead. Scotland Yard has taken a keen interest in the matter. Indeed, I have been in correspondence with Inspector Bradstreet, and I am informed that an arrest is imminent. This, delivered with solemn conviction, stirred visible unease. I saw Eliza stiffen, her hands clenching. Rupert shifted his weight. Only Hargreaves remained still, though his jaw had tightened by a hair's breadth. Holmes allowed the statement to hang in the air a moment longer before continuing. We are confident that the missing sapphire will soon be recovered. In the meantime, I ask that all members of the household remain indoors until further notice. We must not risk alerting the guilty party. A murmur of assent followed, subdued and laced with uncertainty. That afternoon, Holmes summoned me privately. They will not wait long, he said. If the thief intends to return or tamper further, it will be tonight, under cover of our false confidence. And if they do not come, then we lose nothing but sleep. But I believe guilt, Watson, is an itch that must be scratched. And tonight, I intend to catch the hand in the act. It was near midnight when Holmes and I took up our post in the drawing-room, cloaked in silence and darkness. Holmes had extinguished every lamp save one, a low flame that cast more shadow than light and concealed us behind a tall screen near the far wall. The case where the sapphire had once rested now held a convincing imitation, its duller gleam carefully chosen to mimic the real gem under dim conditions. Holmes crouched beside me, his breathing slow and steady, eyes fixed on the door with unyielding intensity. I confess my own nerves were taut with anticipation. Hours passed, measured only by the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional groan of settling timbers. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the panes. At last, some time past 2, there came the softest creak, the sort of sound that might be dismissed by the inattentive as the whim of the old house. But Holmes stirred. The door opened with excruciating care. A figure emerged, a slight frame, cloaked, gloved, face obscured beneath a scarf. They approached the case with practiced familiarity and, with a trembling hand, reached inside their coat. Holmes's whisper brushed my ear. "Watch her fingers." She withdrew a pouch and opened it. A replica stone, nearly identical to the original, was produced and set within the glass dome with delicate reverence. Holmes waited a moment longer, then rose. "That will do, Miss Trent." The woman froze. I stood as well, revolver in hand, though she made no move to flee. She turned slowly, her eyes filled not with guilt, but with fear. "I was trying to put it back," she whispered. "And yet you helped remove it," Holmes replied, stepping into the light. "Now tell us, who else knows?" The silence deepened, and then footsteps thundered down the corridor. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed with ominous finality, but Holmes stood his ground, eyes fixed upon the trembling figure before us. Eliza Trent, no longer masked, but visibly stricken, lowered her head as if the weight of the room itself had come crashing down upon her. "You were not followed," Holmes said, though more as a statement than a question. "Yet you were not alone in this." Her lips parted, then closed again. I could see she wrestled with some inner torment, a conflict that had likely been eating at her since the night of the theft. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered. "It was only meant to scare her, to make her think it was gone for good." Holmes regarded her steadily. "You had access. You possessed a key." She shook her head. "Number Mr. Hargreaves. He gave it to me. Said it was just a lesson. Said no harm would come." "And the replica?" I asked. "I had it made in Soho. He told me what to say, what to wear. I didn't know what he truly planned. But when the snuff box vanished, I knew he hadn't stopped. I thought, if I returned the sapphire quietly, perhaps it would all go away." "Crime rarely fades with silence," Holmes said. "It festers." A noise at the door stilled us once more, a heavy tread this time, measured, deliberate. Holmes glanced at me and drew a breath. "Eliza," he said softly, "step aside." The door burst inward with a force that startled even me. There stood Hargreaves. He was no longer the dignified butler of days past. His eyes burned with cold purpose, and in his gloved hand he held a revolver, trained not at Holmes or myself, but at the girl who now stood between us and the truth. "Move," he growled. Eliza gasped. "Please, don't—" But Hargreaves took a step forward, the weapon steady in his grasp. Holmes's voice cut in, level and low. "You are a soldier no longer, Hargreaves. Lay down your arms." But the man did not blink. I stepped forward. There are moments in life when instinct overtakes reason, when action precedes thought. This, I am convinced, was such a moment. I had no time to consider the angle, the range, or even the consequences. I stepped swiftly between Hargreaves and Eliza, my shoulders squared, my arm raised not in aggression, but in defiance. "Enough," I said, the word louder than intended. Hargreaves' expression flickered. Whether from recognition or surprise, I cannot say. But in that brief flicker, Holmes acted. Like a coiled spring, he moved in a single, fluid motion, catching Hargreaves' wrist and wrenching it downward. The revolver clattered to the floor. Eliza cried out. I moved to retrieve the weapon, my hand trembling more than I cared to admit. Holmes had already pinned Hargreaves to the sideboard, his forearm across the man's chest. "You were never going to let her walk away," Holmes said coldly. "This was not protection. It was erasure." Hargreaves struggled, but his strength had left him. "She was weak," he spat. "She'd have told everything. We had a plan, a righteous one, but she lost her nerve." "You speak of righteousness while pointing a gun at a frightened girl," Holmes replied, his voice quiet now. "You are not the soldier you imagine yourself to be." Lady Amelia, awakened by the noise, appeared in the doorway, robe drawn tight around her. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the discarded revolver, the trembling maid, the unmasked fury of her most trusted servant. "I trusted you," she whispered. Hargreaves said nothing. Holmes stepped back, letting the man slump into the armchair beside the fire. He looked suddenly aged, deflated of all menace. "I shall summon Inspector Bradstreet," Holmes said. "There will be charges enough to keep you occupied for some time." To Eliza, he turned with a gentleness rarely shown. "You made a grave error," he said, "but fear, when guided by conscience, can still serve justice." And thus the trap had sprung. Yet the snare had caught not merely a thief, but a man undone by conviction, guilt, and the long shadows cast by empire. When Inspector Bradstreet arrived shortly thereafter, Holmes greeted him with his usual reserve and offered a succinct summary of events. Hargreaves, seated still and silent in the armchair, made no attempt to protest as he was placed under custody. Yet Holmes, with characteristic precision, was not yet finished. "I believe," he said, turning to Lady Amelia and the inspector alike, "that certain threads must be drawn together before the fabric of this affair is properly understood." He turned his gaze upon Hargreaves. "You were once a quartermaster's aide in Bengal, were you not?" Hargreaves' jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, "You travelled with Colonel Carstairs during his final campaigns. You saw firsthand the seizure of artifacts, the looting of palaces under the pretext of victory. The Star of Caligat was one such relic, taken not as spoil of war, but as personal tribute." Lady Amelia gasped softly. "You considered the gem stolen, not by you, but by the Empire, and by your employer. And so, when it came into Lady Amelia's possession, you viewed its return as a form of restitution." Bradstreet raised an eyebrow. "So this was political?" Holmes shook his head. "No, not quite. It was personal. A warped sense of honour cloaked in loyalty. Hargreaves saw himself as custodian of justice, using Eliza to execute the plan, concealing his own hand until necessity forced it forward." He paused. The replica was his idea, the removal, a symbolic act. But when the girl hesitated, when she expressed doubts, he saw only risk, and risk, to men like Hargreaves, must be silenced. Hargreaves' only reply was a bitter laugh, low and mirthless. "It belonged to India," he muttered. "I simply took back what never should have left." Holmes offered no reply. The silence that followed was its own judgment. Eliza Trent remained after the inspector departed, seated near the window with hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had not spoken since the confrontation, but Holmes regarded her now with a gentleness uncharacteristic of his usual demeanour. "You may speak freely," he said. She glanced up, her voice faint but steady. "I never meant to be part of anything wicked. Mr. Hargreaves told me the Sapphire was cursed, that it had brought ruin to all who touched it. He said returning it would bring peace. At first, I believed him." She paused, looking toward the cold hearth. But then he changed. He said I must take it. He gave me gloves, instructions, even the velvet pouch. When I hesitated, he reminded me I had no references, no family. Nothing but this post. I was frightened. And yet you attempted to return the gem, Holmes said softly. I couldn't bear it. The guilt, the lies. Every time Lady Amelia looked at me with trust, it felt like a blade, so I had the replica made. I planned to put it back without anyone knowing. Holmes gave a faint nod. Your motives were clouded, but your heart was not devoid of conscience. He turned to Lady Amelia. She may have committed an act of deception, but she did so under coercion. I recommend leniency if such be yours to offer. Lady Amelia, though shaken, inclined her head slowly. Let her remain for now, she said. Let her be seen, not as a servant, but as a soul who dared to put things right. And thus, the final note of that dark composition rang not with condemnation, but with quiet, human grace. We returned to Baker Street the following evening, our cloaks damp with the ever-thickening fog that clung to the city like a shroud. Holmes said little on the journey, and I, well accustomed to his periods of reflective silence, made no attempt to disturb it. The fire was still warm upon our arrival. Mrs. Hudson, in her wisdom, had prepared for our return. Holmes settled into his armchair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, staring into the flames. I occupied my usual seat opposite, my notebook at the ready, knowing full well that the time had come. You have questions, Watson, he said without shifting his gaze. Several, I admitted, though I believe I understand more than I did a week ago. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles. And yet you seek the chain, the logical thread which binds all things. Very well. Let us begin, as we must, with scent. I nodded, for indeed it was the aroma, strange and lingering, that had first sparked Holmes's curiosity. The study, Holmes began, did not smell of Belgravia. It smelled of bazaars, of heat, of cardamom and cinnamon, an olfactory signature far too specific to be accidental. And thus I knew someone had handled a spice pouch deliberately. And Hargrave? I asked. Ah, yes, Hargrave's past, long buried beneath years of obedient service, had risen like smoke. And in that smoke, Watson, there was purpose. He leaned forward. Everything else, the locked case, the replica, the vanished snuff box, was merely choreography. But it was the scent that told me the conductor's name. Holmes stood and crossed to the mantel, where he retrieved a small pouch from beneath a stack of correspondence. He held it aloft between thumb and forefinger. This, he said, is the same blend that lingered in Lady Amelia's study. An incense pouch commonly used in Calcutta, both for ceremonial purposes and to protect delicate fabrics and jewels from humidity and insects. Our merchant in Lambeth confirmed that 2 such pouches were purchased only a fortnight ago by a man calling himself Hargrave. So he used it to hide his scent, I asked. To disguise it, rather, Holmes corrected. A thief leaves behind many traces, fingerprints, footprints, oils. But a soldier-turned-smuggler knows the value of diversion. The scent was meant to confound the senses, to introduce an exotic element that would suggest a foreign intruder. Hargrave was planting a narrative, one that would cast suspicion outward. And the fibres? I prompted. Also deliberate, black velvet, fine and soft, matching neither Eliza's uniform nor anything found within the house, likely cut from a ceremonial sash, again, something suggestive of distant origins. Holmes sat once more. He had intended to reclaim the gem as a symbolic act. In his eyes, the Empire had stolen it. He was merely correcting a theft. The act of removing it, then returning a replica, was not theft, but ritual. But when Eliza hesitated, he grew desperate. The snuff box was an act of escalation, meant to unsettle, to provoke, and when the risk of exposure grew, he sought to silence the girl permanently. That was his error, Watson. Passion, not precision, betrayed him. I shook my head. And yet all from scent? All from scent, Holmes replied. A man may mask his intent, his name, even his guilt, but the air he moves through tells a tale all its own. And the melody? I asked. The flute Miss Langford heard, it was real then? Quite real, Holmes replied. A calculated signal, and an elegant one at that. He reached for his violin and tuned a string absently. The thief required silence, opportunity, and timing. The melody, I believe, was an old Hindustani tune. Simple, repetitive. Hargreaves must have taught it to a hired performer, likely one of his former associates, or a local musician sympathetic to his cause. And it was played to signal Eliza. Precisely. Think of the timing. The music was heard shortly before the gem vanished. It served as the all-clear, marking the absence of Lady Amelia from the room and the readiness of conditions. Eliza, who had been coached thoroughly, was to interpret it as the moment to act. And Miss Langford? Holmes smiled. A fortunate complication. Her sleeplessness placed her in the path of a clue the others would never have noticed. She heard what was not meant to be heard, and so gave us the final proof that the act was not one of impulse, but orchestration. He paused, drawing the bow softly across the strings. The case, in its way, was a symphony of deception, melody, scent, and silence. Hargreaves composed it with skill, but as with all such compositions, a single wrong note can bring the entire performance crashing down. He set the violin aside. And in this instance, it was played in a key too sharp for the truth to remain hidden. Do you recall the garden prints, Watson? Holmes asked, pouring himself a measure of brandy. Those shallow impressions near the flower beds. I do, I replied. You dismissed them at the time. I deferred judgment, he corrected, raising a finger. Their significance was not yet ripe. You noted that the smaller prints were more deliberate, less hurried than the deeper ones. I nodded. The deeper set, he continued, belonged to Hargreaves, returning to the house. But the smaller ones, those were not Eliza's. They belonged to the courier. Courier? Indeed, an associate Hargreaves employed to deliver the replica gem. A former contact, no doubt, from his smuggling days. It was too great a risk for him to carry both himself. The courier approached through the garden, passed off the replica under cover of darkness, then fled. Hence the staggered pacing, haste in departure, caution in approach. And yet you never mentioned him until now. I suspected his existence, but had no proof until I saw the replica itself. Its crafting bespoke someone who had handled such objects before. An artisan, perhaps, but the timing required external assistance. Holmes leaned back. In this affair, every movement bore meaning. Even the footsteps in the soil were not the whispers of ghosts, but the footprints of complicity. And Rupert Carstairs? I asked. What of him? Holmes gave a dismissive wave. A red herring, albeit a finely bred one. You don't believe he was involved. Number though his debts in Ceylon are regrettable, they are wholly unrelated to the case at hand. He was watched, followed, and even assaulted, yet revealed nothing beyond poor judgment and unfortunate associations. And the slip of paper. A coded note for a bookmaker. I had it deciphered by an acquaintance in Whitehall. There was nothing criminal, merely foolish. I sat back. So all his shadowy behaviour was coincidental. Coincidence, Holmes said, is a treacherous companion in our line of work. It lures many down the wrong path. Rupert's guilt was one of appearance, not action. His evasiveness stemmed from shame, not subterfuge. He rose and crossed to the window, the fog now curling like smoke beyond the glass. Lady Amelia saw in him a threat to her inheritance. Hargreaves saw a convenient scapegoat. But I saw a man burdened by debt, not duplicity. There was a pause before Holmes added, "Not all who stand in shadow do so by design. Some are simply lost within it." Lady Amelia received the full explanation in quiet dignity. She listened without interruption as Holmes recounted the timeline, the planning, and the layered deceit of those she had trusted most. Her face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly against the arm of her chair. "That Hargrave," she began, then stopped, searching for words that would not come. "He believed himself acting with moral cause," Holmes said gently. "But conviction, divorced from conscience, becomes dangerous. He saw himself as avenger, not servant." "And Eliza?" Holmes nodded. "A pawn. Misguided, yes, but not cruel." Lady Amelia exhaled. "And I never suspected. That is the deepest wound of all. Not that something precious was stolen, but that the hands I relied upon were those that moved against me." Holmes offered no platitude. "Trust," he said softly, "is rarely betrayed by enemies. It is the costliest gift we offer, and the one most easily turned against us." She stood and gathered herself. "I shall speak with the board. Let the Sapphire be donated to the Calcutta Museum, where it belongs. It has drawn enough sorrow here." Holmes inclined his head. "That would be a gesture of healing." She turned away, and though her voice was steady, I knew the wound would linger longer than any scandal ever could. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Holmes grew uncharacteristically reflective. "You see, Watson," he said, "the case was never simply about a stolen gem. It was about history, about the legacies we inherit, willingly or otherwise." "You refer to Hargrave?" "To all of them. Hargrave, Amelia, Eliza, even Rupert. Each, in their way, was entangled in something far older and more complex than mere theft. The Sapphire was a symbol of conquest, entitlement, and guilt. Its presence in that house was an echo of empire, and echoes have a way of distorting truth." I was silent a moment, struck by the weight of his words. "Is justice ever truly clean?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Justice, like empire, is crafted by men. And men," he added, "are fallible." He reached for his pipe. "Still, I take comfort in this. The gem has found its peace, and perhaps so too shall those it touched." I have seen Holmes unravel many mysteries, but few that left me pondering as deeply as this. It was not the mechanics of the theft that lingered in my mind, but the motives, the bruised loyalties, the tangled sense of right and wrong. Holmes, ever the master of deduction, had pierced the veil as always. Yet in the quiet that followed, it was his final words that stayed with me. "The most perplexing puzzles," he had said, "are not locked behind glass, Watson, but buried in the hearts of men." And on that thought, we let the fire burn low. As the fire dimmed into glowing embers and the last whisper of fog clung to the window panes, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You know, Watson," he murmured, "men like Hargrave rarely see themselves as criminals. They cloak their theft in cause, their coercion in duty, and their betrayal in loyalty. It is a dangerous thing when righteousness outpaces reason. I nodded thoughtfully. And yet he was not mad, merely convinced. Precisely, Holmes replied. A delusion is no less perilous for being orderly, and conscience, when buried beneath ideology, becomes not a compass, but a shield. He turned to me with a faint smile. In the end, it was not the locked case, nor the missing gem, that proved most perplexing, but the ease with which a man may justify anything, if only he believes it serves a higher end. Holmes stood and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain just enough to peer into the misted street. "Tell me, Watson," he said, without turning, "what do you think was Hargreaves' greatest mistake? The replica gem, trusting Eliza, or believing his cause absolved the crime? And now, dear listener, the case is closed, but the mystery lives on in your hands. What do you think was the criminal's biggest error? Was it tactical, emotional, or moral? Share your thoughts in the comments. Holmes would be most intrigued by your deductions. If you enjoyed this tale of shadows and sapphire, do consider subscribing for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And of course, pass the story along to a fellow mystery lover. After all, every puzzle becomes clearer when discussed over a cup of tea or a midnight fire. Until the next case, keep your eyes sharp and your conscience sharper.